All right. Welcome everyone for this new exciting webinar. We are NoBumpNoCare, a non-profit that works in perinatal care. Me and my colleague Nicole Miglio founded this non-profit to support a person who are going through their reproductive journey in their lives. We have a stellar network of partners and colleagues in different areas, philosophical counselors, lawyers, fitness experts, and nutritionists from all over the world. Today, we are very lucky to host the webinar of Zsuzsanna Chappel. Sorry for my pronunciation, it came out very Italian. She's an amazing scholar. She's a British-Hungarian social philosopher whose work bridges political theory, ethics, and mental health. She's the author of Deliberative Democracy, A Critical Introduction in 2012, a widely cited text that offers a systematic and critical review of deliberative democracy theory and practice. Nevertheless, she expanded on so many themes that it's hard to summarize here. Today, she's going to present on pregnancy trauma. The floor is all yours, Zsuzsanna. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar today.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Zsuzsanna Chappel, and in the interest of since I work on philosophy of disability as well, and actually one of my co-authors is blind. I am a white woman in my 40s, and I'm going to talk about pregnancy trauma today. Let me share my slides. Right. Come on, to slideshow. Great. Got it set up now. So first of all, I guess I don't normally talk about anything related to pregnancy and childbirth because they've both been incredibly traumatic for me. I've experienced pregnancy trauma twice and birth trauma once, the first time round. And it left me with really serious PTSD symptoms and very poor mental health, as well as other long-term health problems and disabilities. So this is, outside of my normal range of talks because it's more, it affects me very, very personally. Right, I seem to have lost my screen. Oops, I'm not sure what I've done. How do I find my slides again? This is very embarrassing.
I know, I can relate completely. Not embarrassing at all.
Oh, got it. I think I've got it. Right. How do I make it big? Right, because right now, my slides look very small. I might have to stop sharing and start again. I'm really sorry. I seem to have pushed something and everything went away and left me embarrassed, which is, as I just said, this is a very personal topic. So just being embarrassed by, random screen sharing problems is perfect. So I'm not a psychologist and I don't have any empirical data to present to you on pregnancy trauma. So you might wonder, why a philosopher would still want to give a talk on pregnancy trauma, which is a concept that doesn't really exist without having all this empirical background. And my answer is philosophy is about concepts. a lot of the works philosophers do has to do with concepts. And it's worth establishing that pregnancy trauma is different from birth trauma. For example, you can do this as a philosopher without any empirical data. Philosophy and epistemic injustice. So ever since the publication of Miranda Fricker's book on epistemic injustice about 20 years ago, there's been a lot of attention paid to epistemic injustice, and basically it's a hermeneutical injustice not to have access to the right concepts to make sense of our own experience and explain it to others. And not pregnancy trauma is not a concept that has any currency, either in research or in popular understanding, but as I hope I'll show, it is very different from birth trauma or other types of trauma related to reproduction. And then, of course, from the perspective of applied philosophy and ethics, which I do most of the time, calling attention to injustice in the way that we treat pregnant persons is important, and I think that pregnancy can be an important site of injustice in this sense. And I will try and say pregnant persons rather than mothers or women for most of this talk. We've had a talk in this series already which highlighted the importance of more gender-neutral language when we talk about birth, pregnancy, fertility, and so on. But if I say mother at some point, then mainly I'm thinking of myself, and that's why I kind of slips in. Right. Margaret Olivia Little, in a paper on abortion and pregnancy in 1999, writes, "Let me put it more bluntly. The central figures in the abortion drama, fetus, gestating woman, and their relationship, are left out of the conceptual paradigm. When we reason about them, we appeal to analogies that are at best awkward, at worst dangerous, but always distorting, for we are trying to analogize to classifications that have at their root the denial of the situation we confront. Rather than wondering if the fetus should be thought of as more like a tumor or a very small child, the gestational fetal relationship more like a contract or a kidnapping, we might be having conversations about how well or poorly tumors, children, contracts, and kidnappings match the category of gestation and its elements." And I think Little really captures this problem in philosophy, and especially analytical philosophy, that when we talk about pregnancy, we talk about it in ways that don't really capture much of the essence of what pregnancy is for people involved in it. And thanks to the work of lots of philosophers, there is now a lot more, not just on abortion, which has been a topic in philosophy for a long time, but also on infertility, miscarriage, birth, and so on, that are sites of difficulty. And also lots of activists and academics researchers have worked on all of these as a site of trauma as well, important sites of trauma, and how they affect the lives of all of us. But pregnancy trauma is not a concept. If you Google it, it's not a thing. And my argument today basically is that it should be a thing, because not just because I've experienced it, but when I started talking to people about it, a lot of other people, especially mostly women, but not just women, have experienced it. And, just listening to them, there just seems to be no recognition in society or in healthcare systems that pregnancy trauma is a thing and it's something we should worry about. And I will define pregnancy trauma, especially not being a psychologist, as very, very simply. And I will say that it is trauma that accompanies and is integral to the pregnancy experience, and it transforms the pregnancy experience. So we don't just have pregnancy plus a traumatic event happening simultaneously, but the traumatic event or the source of trauma transforms the pregnancy, transforms the relationship that the pregnant person has with the fetus or child, transforms relationships with everyone around them, with themselves as well. And, it's a long-lasting trauma. And pregnancy, of course, includes changes in our minds and our bodies. It comes with vulnerability. It has a special relationship with the fetus. And all of these interact with the source of trauma. I think it's important to separate birth trauma from pregnancy trauma. So when activist organizations that talk about pregnancy-related illnesses, like the Pregnancy Sickness Support charity in the UK, link hyperemesis to birth trauma and kind of try and focus on how hyperemesis is linked with birth trauma, but not, there's no real talk about pregnancy trauma. But the two are obviously distinct events, because pregnancy and birth are obviously very different. One is much longer than the other. I mean, we can think of lots of differences. And in terms of no bump, no care, especially if you've got pregnancy-related illnesses, you might not even look pregnant for much of the pregnancy. With my first pregnancy, I didn't visibly look pregnant until the 3rd trimester. So this is a non-exhaustive list of causes of pregnancy trauma. There's lots of reasons it could happen. Pregnancy-related illness, a health threat to the fetus or baby, a threat of miscarriage or stillbirth, imprisonment. Hundreds of women in the UK are incarcerated during pregnancy and childbirth in the UK every year, and worldwide, obviously, the numbers are huge. War, being pregnant while war is going on around you, poverty, domestic abuse, regretting parenthood. So maybe you've become pregnant and you don't feel that you can end the pregnancy because you've always wanted to be pregnant, but you realized suddenly that it's just all wrong. Unwanted pregnancies, body dysphoria, especially for trans and non-binary parents, fear of pregnancy or past trauma. So I know someone who experienced pregnancy trauma because their mother died of childbirth, and also all kinds of past trauma, childhood trauma as well, can impact on pregnancy. But I think it's not really medical versus social causes. I think injustice is still present given our attitude to illnesses and our lack of knowledge about them. Even if the trauma is due to pregnancy-related illness, much of the cause of trauma still seems to be social through lack of understanding, lack of research, and so on. And I found that thinking again of Little's argument that we are just making very odd comparisons when it comes to pregnancy. I found that this resonated with my experience, this small section from Barth's A Lover's Discourse. And the Lover's Discourse, of course, is about romantic love, but, love can be, thinking of different types of love as opposed to thinking about tumors when it comes to pregnancy makes more sense to me. And in this section on engulfment, he writes, I am engulfed, I succumb. It is outbursts of annihilation which affects the amorous subject in despair or fulfillment. And I felt, especially during my pregnancies, that there was both despair and fulfillment. The crisis of engulfment can come from a wound, but also from a fusion. We die together from loving each other, an open death by dilution into the ether, a closed death of the shared grave. Engulfment is a moment of hypnosis, a suggestion functions which commands me to swim without killing myself, whence perhaps the gentleness of the abyss. I have no responsibility here. The act of dying is not up to me. I entrust myself, I transit myself to whom? To God, to nature, to everything except to the other. And I thought this was quite a good description of my experience because it was both a fusion with my baby, but it was also a wound, serious pregnancy-related illness. And I felt a kind of loss of power or a loss of ability to do anything other than be. But at the same time, the experience had a gentleness of being and non-being at the same time. I wasn't able to do much. I was in bed most of the time. But again, I seemed to transmit myself to everything except to the other. There was this kind of thing that got in the way of bonding with my child. I thought that this captured my experience quite well when I was reading it a couple of weeks ago. So pregnancy trauma is actually not entirely unknown as a philosophical topic, because if we have a look at the classic text on abortion in analytical philosophy, Thompson's A Defense of Abortion, dating to 1971, so quite a while back, over 50 years now, she writes, "You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to bed in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we are sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. But then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to this situation? No doubt it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness, but do you have to accede to it?" And that seems to me more like a description of pregnancy trauma than anything else, apart from the fact that any violin playing is going to start in the future of a child rather than while still in the womb. And of course, as others, including Little, who I cited earlier, have pointed out, there are various problems with this. So would our intuitions differ about this third experiment? Is if instead of an unconscious violinist, you've been plugged in together with a child, a grown-up child, maybe a grown-up child you haven't seen since you've given them up for adoption after their birth. Would it make a difference if it was a man plugged in, maybe a man who has had a one-night stand and is now suddenly informed 20 years later that he's plugged in next to the child that resulted from this one-night stand? How would all these different variations change our intuitions? Is already makes it difficult, and of course. It's not really what pregnancy is like. Although I have to say that my pregnancy, compared to my pregnancies, being plugged in next to a famous violinist or any violinist or anyone really for those months would have been much better than my pregnancy experience, because it was just so horrific. And Thompson's paper is about the permissibility of abortion. Is abortion unjust killing? She asks, is it unjust killing when the mother's life is at stake or when it isn't? As in the case of pregnancy trauma. If you do allow him to use your kidneys, it is a kindness on your part, but not something you owe him. So it's a question of beneficence rather than duty. And also she asks, if she voluntarily called it into existence, the fetus, how can she now kill it even in self-defense? But this is just to highlight that in a way, pregnancy trauma has been there in philosophy about abortion from the beginning, but this talk is not about abortion. So pregnancy trauma has serious repercussions. I think for the parents' future relationships, physical and mental health, but also for other family members, especially older children. I've really seen this in my older child during my second pregnancy, which would really make me hesitate from having any more children, because just inflicting that on others, your children around you, is very, very difficult. For the unborn child, as you might not be able to bond appropriately. Some parents might even blame the child for the trauma, but also for clinicians, social workers, or anyone else who is trying to help the pregnant person. And we have all these social attitudes about pregnancy, which kind of make us ignore the pregnancy trauma. So, in recent debates around abortion as well in the US, people talk about forced birth, which just seems odd because, well, in between conception and birth, there's quite a long period of time. Even if we limit abortion to 12 weeks, that still leaves an extra 6 months, which is, quite a chunk of your life. But a lot of the time, people will say, oh, well, it's only for 9 months if you're ill, for example. There are social attitudes and gendered behavior around pregnant people, which might make it difficult, especially for gender non-conforming people. Pregnancy can be seen as a form of work. So in Maternal Imprint, Richardson writes about all these expectations that are now placed on mothers and other pregnant people, often not really rooted in, very good science about how stress, diet, anything you do as a pregnant person will impact your child's life forever, through epigenetics or whatever. There are all these expectations that pregnant people will glow. I was told that I was glowing even when I was, barely able to walk. You're always told pregnancy is not an illness, but at the same time, that's of course true, but the pregnancy-related illnesses are just completely neglected. And there is this sanitized view of pregnancy-related illness. Both of my pregnancies, I had severe hyperemesis, which is not just bad morning sickness, but also apart from vomiting, constant nausea, inability to eat or drink, also has lots of exciting neurological symptoms. Um, all the all the pictures accompanying articles about pregnant hyperemesis were all had women wearing kind of white pajamas or whatever. And I was just sitting by the toilet, looking concerned. And I just thought, this is just so unrealistic. If you're vomiting all the time, you're not going to wear white pajamas, and actually your clothes are going to go first. And in my experience, if you have hyperemesis, it's not just that you're vomiting uncontrollably all the time, but everything else lets go. So, you're just covered in urine and fecal matter and everything. And although those tend to disappear as you can't eat and drink, so, only the dry heaving remain, which is really not captured in this sanitized view. It's really a very ugly thing that's happening. And there is a lack of funding and interest in research and in support. There's very, very little funding. When you find research papers on hyperemesis, for example, often when it comes to fund, how was this funded? There's no funding. It's like people do it in their out of their own, whenever they can. And the other thing is people often get blamed for trauma during pregnancy because you're meant to, it's part of being a good parent not to be traumatized by your pregnancy. In Facebook support groups for hyperemesis, what was mentioned all the time by people was how their families would blame them. They'd be even accused of developing an eating disorder or doing it on purpose somehow. A lot of people were left by their families, and this just seems to be true for pregnancy trauma, that there's very little support, not just from society, but from families as well. Because trauma can result in PTSD, hypervigilance, flashback, extremely quick arousal around perceived threats. Now, 3 years after the birth of my younger child, it's starting to recede a little bit, but it's still there. Or we could even wonder if pregnancy trauma might be an example of complex PTSD, because complex PTSD is the result of repeated or sustained trauma. And pregnancy lasts month and month and month. And one may have more than one traumatic pregnancy. I had two. And this disrupts life severely for years beyond pregnancy. For hyperemesis, which I've had, PTSD rates are around 20% of survivors. And I mean, there's just the question as well with all the changes in our bodies, in our brains. Now we know from neuroimaging, hormones, everything. Does it make a difference to PTSD? Are PTSD symptoms worse in any way or different in any way? There's no research on this because, I mean, why would there be? I was just looking at the website of one of the main PTSD support organizations in the UK, and PTSD from birth, pregnancy, and so on is not even, on their list of things that you get PTSD from, even though it's very, very common. And also, it's worth remembering that apparently suicide is one of the most common fatal pregnancy and birth complications, which is, I always find it's an odd way of putting it. So, returning to philosophy, after kind of like a layperson's introduction to what pregnancy trauma might be if we had such a concept. Um, I mean, firstly, there is the question of moral priorities and whose rights, which we have from abortion debates. Abortion debates are often about the rights of the fetus versus the rights of the gestating person. But this applies not just to abortion, but also to all kinds of things during pregnancy, which might be very traumatic, which happened to me as well. So, right to pain relief is now a human right according to the WHO and other bodies in 2004. It's been declared a human right. And this is widely endorsed by UN bodies as well. But the exception is that if you're pregnant, pain relief or even access to the right antibiotics might hurt the fetus or the baby. So we're not giving it to you. I had an ear infection, which because of complications from pregnancy-related illnesses, had further complications. And the only way I can describe it is that the inside of one of my ears literally melted. This was incredibly painful. I mean, childbirth is nothing compared to it. And I had no pain relief because think of the baby. You might be hurting the baby by, or the right antibiotics. You might be hurting the baby by not having the inside of your ear melting out. And we just focus on the positive responsibilities of the gestating person. Once we have moved past the question of abortion, okay, you're not having an abortion, then in that case, then it's all about your responsibilities, which just seem to be completely unlimited. Once you consent to being pregnant, then your responsibilities are suddenly completely unlimited, from not eating the wrong kind of cheese to not receiving pain relief, even for extremely severe pain. And this just seems to be a very odd kind of choice for some people in moral philosophy, analytic moral philosophy. We often talk about, is money or your life? That is that question. Is that actually a choice situation? And it can seem like pregnancy trauma, or all these things that can go with pregnancy, whether I focus here mostly in my descriptions on pregnancy related illness because that's what I've got experience of, but all kinds of other things as well, like being pregnant while incarcerated. These choices are, either you have an abortion, or you put up with anything, being handcuffed routinely, not having access to antenatal appointments, and all these things happening to pregnant people in prison. Once you make that choice, then anything goes. And of course, there's the question of consent, philosophical question of consent. Even if we are consenting, we didn't consent to this. I mean, I certainly didn't consent to being treated the way I've been treated. And your usual response to it, well, if you're not consenting, let's say, the most often discussed case of our bodies and consent is consent to sex. The usual response is, well, if you don't like it, then you withdraw consent and you say no. In this case, you have an abortion, but surely there could be other solutions as well. So a thought experiment, or as an analogy, let's say you consent to have sex with a partner and you find that the sexual act is painful. So, you could have multiple options here. You could either just withdraw consent and not have sex, or you could explore ways in which you remove the pain and then, enjoy whatever follows. But in the case of pregnancy, we just don't seem to have, it just seems to be a yes or no consent thing. So it does seem to me very possible once we remove to the list of sources of pregnancy trauma, that even if we cannot always remove these things, at least, we can work towards removing them, lessening them, removing the trauma, treating people for their trauma properly, and so on. I think the problem of pregnancy trauma also highlights that really there is a blurred line between miscarriage and abortion, like, spontaneous miscarriage or medically induced miscarriage. So in pregnancy, in the literature on abortion, there's often a harm reduction approach to abortion. So we think about the harm to the, if we're not thinking about rights, we might be thinking about harm. So the harm to the fetus, the harm to the parent, and beyond to society or the family and so on. But then when we look at something like hyperemesis, it's a major cause of ending wanted pregnancies. So people want a child, but they just find themselves unable to go through the suffering that having that child implies. And in this case, can say, is this really, I'm not saying is it a genuine abortion, but it's not the dividing line between losing a child to spontaneous miscarriage and losing a wanted child to medically induced miscarriage. It becomes a lot more. It becomes a lot less, philosophically well defined. I mean, we can easily define it in terms of how it happens biologically, but when it comes to moral questions, then suddenly we might start to think, when is a pregnancy really wanted? You might want a child, but you might not want the pregnancy. So there might be differences between wanted pregnancies and wanted children, or even there could be a wanted pregnancy without a wanted child. So there are all these things that we don't really think about. We think about these issues philosophically. But in a way, it's similar to debates about euthanasia, where we worry that disabled people might choose euthanasia just because they are not getting the right medical treatment, their social needs are not met. They may be living in poverty, not have access to housing, not have access to medical care. And again, the meaningfulness of these choices diminishes. And I think it's very important that the preconditions of a good pregnancy are provided before we can really say which pregnancies are wanted or not wanted. Right, and I seem to have lost the slide, which was about what makes a good pregnancy. And a good pregnancy is one that I think is again something we don't talk much about, but it should be about the right kind of relationship between the gestating person and the fetus or baby. And Little, whom I mentioned multiple times now, says that there is this enmeshment between the gestating person and the fetus, which needs to be taken into account. And having this kind of strong enmeshment is part of a good pregnancy. And in a paper by Hannah de Jager, and if I had the slide, I would know who the other author is. I apologize. It's an activist philosophy paper about pregnancy in which they argue that pregnancy is not a passive experience either on the part of a gestating person or the fetus, but rather of a shared experience where the two bodies continuously respond to each other from the very beginning, and their agencies change and develop throughout the pregnancy. And we need to guarantee a way in which people can successfully do this. And lacking successful ways of having this good relationship between the gestating person and the fetus is a part of pregnancy trauma. So what to do? What's the consequences of this? I think we need a lot of theoretical and empirical research into pregnancy trauma, which doesn't even exist as a concept. So let's first have a concept, and then let's have theoretical and empirical research about it. But even without that, we can do lots to listen to pregnant people, support them, figure out what kind of support might be helpful. So in my second pregnancy, I had extra ultrasound scans, which were enormously helpful. I know some people object to ultrasound scans for all kinds of philosophical reasons, but they can also be extremely useful in building a bond when that bond is otherwise compromised. And as I've been arguing, we just need the social prerequisites of preventing traumatic pregnancy. So for me, this is a kind of an odd talk because there's just less to draw on, less research and less to draw on than I normally do. It's mostly kind of like an invitation for people to consider that pregnancies can be traumatic, that this is a real problem. It affects many, many people, whether there's gestating person or others, and we should be doing something about it. So thank you very much. I don't know how we're doing for time.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsanna. I completely support your call for reflection and knowledge and action. Thank you so much. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Here I put on the chat maybe the title of the paper you were referring to, the paper of the Jaeger and Quintero, Pregnant Agencies.
Yeah, that's the one.
This one,
that's
right?
The one. I'm very
paper.
bad at remembering names, so it was impressive that I remembered, one author.
No, it's really a good one. I totally agree with you. And they talk about, the importance of understanding the corporeal schema that
Yes.
the baby starts the fetus starts developing, and see how the two agencies develop. So really beautiful paper.
And I think pregnancy trauma, whether it's illness or anything other causes, can really disrupt this corporeal schema. Just thinking about war as well. If you can't take access to physical safety, food, water for granted, then that will disrupt that as well. And it will be different from just the trauma of war. It's not just pregnancy plus the trauma of war. It's kind of this new form of traumatic experience.
Yeah, it's something to learn anew, and you need to be in that position of Thaumaze in Plato. Look at yourself and try to understand as much as you can of what's going on. And that's where philosophy and humanities can be helpful to breach the research, the dialogue, because every woman feels as if I'm strange to raise questions about something that is so natural. And instead, no, I think it's exactly the opposite. But anyway, I don't want to stop people from asking questions. So please feel free to ask our wonderful speaker your questions or comments. Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Susie, and thank you, Zsuzsanna. That was fantastic. I am super pregnant, so that was at some point, a bit triggering. I was like, okay, likely I'm in my third trimester, but I've got a very bad experience with my last pregnancy that I have to interrupt. So I totally feel the trauma part, and also I was wondering whether you think that this traumatic side is in some sort reinforced socially and also on familiar level. Like, for instance, pregnancy is super smooth, the pregnancy I'm living, but I got severe nausea, low blood pressure, and I'm not myself. And everyone around me, I can't speak of trauma, but still, it's hard. And everyone around me is like, yes, welcome, that's pregnancy, and you will see after childbirth, which is so annoying. I hate it. So first, my question is, do you think that social context and cultural presupposition actually play a role in making more traumatic, some traumatic experiences in the pregnant one? And second question, which is more a reflection or a comment, is whether we can put into the relation the concept of pregnancy trauma with the one of alienation. It's a pregnant alienation, a very widespread concept in the literature. So this, feeling that you are not your body, that something is off, that you are not in control, but you don't resonate with your own body. Something that already is people who are, and then I was very young. So yeah, that's stop here, because if not, go straight. Thank you so much.
So to start with the relatively easier, the second one, I think that can definitely be a source of pregnancy trauma as well, if you feel like your body is not right somehow. And actually, it's funny because the illnesses were very traumatic for me. My dog is going to start howling in a moment. That's his contribution to this. But for me, it felt that the bodily changes felt really natural. So it's really funny how it can come apart as well. Even though I had these really traumatic pregnancies, I didn't have that feeling. And I think it really, I think that can be very traumatic in itself. Yes, your body changing in these really, really strange ways. I mean, I had it easy in that perspective, that for me, that was easy to accept. But I know, just talking to people, and especially when I started, right? I'll get rid of the dogs. Now.
Although I don't hear the dog much, do you?
Sorry.
But she does, certainly.
Yeah.
So anyway, so now that I've put my children out into the garden, so I think, again, these things can come apart, and what is traumatic for one person, again, we can't take it for granted. So, I can't tell the person, oh, but and that's also what I found from other pregnant or from other women. If you say, well, I was the same when I was pregnant and I was fine. So I can't tell another person that just because I found these bodily changes easy, I can't say, well, that really shouldn't be a source of trauma for you. But that's what we do all the time, as you've yourself mentioned as well. That's what we all do all the time as a society. People will say, well, I also had whatever, swollen ankles, just put up with it. But
A form of gaslighting in some sort. I mean, at least
exactly. But also, it's not just gaslighting, because it's in that it's understandable that I didn't have certain problems and it was fine, but that doesn't mean that another person won't find it problematic. And it's just this assumption, and we have all these assumptions around pregnancy, and they're very gendered, and we view pregnant people in a very odd, super gendered way. That can be difficult even for for people who are not, who are comfortable with living as women, but even cis women who are not that comfortable with femininity and so on can find it difficult. So I think, and there's just this general lack of support, because we view, I think the gaslighting bit is that you just so often hear pregnancy is not an illness, it's a natural part of life. You're, blah, 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 endlessly. And yes, I think even when it comes to pregnancy-related illnesses, a lot of the problems come from the social attitudes and the lack of support and the lack of research as well. Is, you know, if all this stuff was happening to men, you know, we would have had a lot more research already. There's from some things, it seems like we don't know that much more than we did, than the Egyptians did, and it's been a while. So, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Other questions? Jennifer, please.
Hello.
Hi.
What a
good to
great
see you.
group. This is like I'm a little fangirling because there's a few of us that are working in this for quite a while, and so it's nice to have such a nice clear outline about this framework in pregnancy and the kind of the erasure of the kind of knowledge making and knowledge generation that comes with the experience of pregnancy, independent, as you know from my work, of the products of pregnancy, like independent of all the outcomes, the possible outcomes, that we don't really have a working catalog of knowledge. So, and what I'm finding now in my research on trauma, and you and I have corresponded a little on this, is the lack of philosophical insight into trauma itself, right? The concept of trauma. And so trying to work on like a critical trauma epistemology. And I'm continental philosopher, so analytic. I'm sorry for the analytic thing, because I could imagine it being so much more taxing to have to work with those frameworks, because, you know, the continentals tend to be a little bit more open to the metaphors and the kind of analogies that are sloppy and contradictory. Like, I'm thinking of Derrida when you're talking, and there's this host hostage paradox situation that he talks about with Levinas, but then for pregnancy, it came really handy. I'm like, oh, it's a host hostage situation that like at any time, any one of us are in this like no right of refusal anymore, right? You don't really have an exit. But I just wanted to add that I think one of the things I'm finding in the research when I think about trauma as an epistemology, as a labor of knowledge production, that when someone has gone through trauma, because again, someone goes through the same experience, may experience no trauma. In very similar circumstances, someone is extremely traumatized and sustains that, and then it marks them for life, right? That you carry this with you. And so one of the things that I'm working on or trying to like capture as well is all the ways in which our social obligations don't deal with the people who don't have a therapeutic attachment to that trauma. There is no like way to remedy the burden of being traumatized. So not only are you talking about an area of trauma in relation to pregnancy that's not covered and not dealt with, but then you have what therapies are out there that are meant to depathologize a person's trauma experience. And then at the same time, while pathologizing them, of course, if they can't be helped or relieved with any of the trauma therapies that are out there. And a lot of it is kind of the Wild West of, you know, research investment, like what works to alleviate trauma, how what works for some people, especially with CPTSD not even being in the DSM, like how very complicated it is to see a person who has no therapeutic relief, who carries a very complex trauma experience and trauma knowledge, and then the like amount of labor to survive it, to continue to kind of sustain oneself in the world, that it continues to like re-traumatize them or have them disassociating and compartmentalizing at every turn just to keep themselves alive, right? So so I think my maybe thought is that and I'd love to talk to you more as you produce more material and stuff like that, about just the problem of using trauma as a concept within philosophy and how limited philosophy is because of how much the psychoanalytic versions of trauma, the kind of subjective kind of psychological ideas about what trauma is, not as a knowledge, but as like an experience, as a, you know, kind of something that shapes our identity or our personhood in like the social political sense. So just in terms of like, are you finding little presence in the philosophy literature that, like you brought up Barth, I thought that was really great. But when it comes to trauma, are you finding concepts or ideas that are particularly useful for that question of what trauma is for the philosopher, or how we might come handy?
Yeah, I think actually, I'm not even sure I'm going to talk about pregnancy or write about pregnancy trauma again, because just talking about this feels like a big achievement to just be able to give this talk and not feel absolutely shattered by doing it, and just feel okay preparing for it and everything. But I do want to start. I do want to do more work on trauma. I'm working on a paper on trauma flashbacks because I find philosophy and philosophical descriptions of trauma flashback are just ridiculously bad. You know, they just compare to, oh, you're remembering something, but that's not how trauma flashbacks work. You know, you're completely displaced in time. It's, you know, how I experience it, or that's how I describe it, like a displacement in time. And it's yeah, I think, you know, philosophy is not very good at trauma, but I think even psychology is not very good at trauma. They tend to be very, very sloppy. It's very, you know, it's all vagueness and sloppiness all about. And I think we could, you know, do a lot more on that. And I think philosophy could help a lot with the conceptual work of reducing that vagueness and sloppiness in psychology. And, you know, this is something that I'm talking to a couple of people about, that we might, you know, do as a project. Obviously, I'll talk to you as well more because, yeah. So I don't know if I mentioned this to you already. But anyway, so yeah, I think philosophy is not very good at it. And also, what I found with trauma is just how unpsychological it is in many ways for me. So, you know, this displacement in time, it's not like some kind of thinking process or even a feeling process. It's like you know, it just happens. Or also the way that one of the things that is really, you know, I think impacts my life is just the extremely short reaction time to anything that's a perceived trigger. And you know, if you're not in this traumatized frame, then even if it's just an extra micro millisecond longer, that you have some kind of chance at emotional regulation. But when you're living with PTSD, you don't have that because there is not that space. And it doesn't matter how much CBT will tell you about emotional regulation. No, you know, my brain says jump, and I've jumped. Yeah, I've just, and it's a work in progress, and it takes a long time. And I think what's interesting is I've had experiences with childhood trauma and also long-term so-called serious mental illness, and it's just very different. The PTSD just seems a lot more. Biological is the wrong word because, you know, I'm really looking for words, but you know, it feels less based on psychology and more on just some primitive, not primitive is also a wrong word. You know, when people start talking about the lizard brain, I hate that. You know, but it's that kind of really neurological aspect of it. Maybe neurological is the right word. Yeah. And I mean, that's like I've mentioned hyperemesis, and I'm shocked at how now there's starting to be some recognition about neurological symptoms of hyperemesis, which for me and a lot of people are worse than the vomiting and gastrointestinal problems. But there's just very little understanding, and whatever research there is on it, it's just basically people's hobby horse projects, which they do unfunded. So, it's just there's very little understanding. And also just what I worry about in terms of lack of research, which I mentioned, is that we finally, now there's neuroimaging. We know that women's brains change. I mean, women have been talking about, baby brain or whatever for a long time, but now we have neuroimaging, so now it's real. Which again goes back to what you said about knowledge production and like these sites of knowledge that we only believe these supposedly objective sites of knowledge. But with all of these changes in the nervous system and the brain, how does that change, let's say, PTSD symptoms later on? Does it make it might make the development of PTSD more likely, if something traumatic happens while you're giving birth. But then afterwards, could we compare women with birth trauma PTSD to people with, I don't know, traffic accident PTSD and see if there's differences, because you never know. But no one asks these questions. No one funds these studies. No one does this work. And I think that's the really horrible thing.
You're so right. Is there any other question also for people on YouTube? Feel free to type it in, and Nicole will let us know, or here on Zoom. And phenomenology did so little in terms of research on PTSD or complex PTSD. I was surprised.
And the stuff that's out there, it does not.
No, it's
It does
too.
not. It seems very different or alien to my experience. There's a lot more. There's always talk about memory, which I think is completely off for me. Just doesn't capture it at all.
Alice.
Thank you for this talk. Was really, really inspiring. I don't really know if it's a follow-up question or a reflection or what it is. I should probably premise that I work a lot on research ethics, and for me it's kind of a long-term battle of trying to convince people that we do need more research when it comes to pregnancy in general, and the fact that even the milder, let's say, symptoms of pregnancy, they shouldn't necessarily be there if we did research and we try to solve them. Like it's not a given that women have to go through nausea. But one thing that I notice is that every time I try to say that, more or less the reaction is always along the side of, oh my God, are you crazy? Are you really suggesting to have research on women, that on pregnant people and on fetuses? That sounds horrible. Except for maternal fetal surgery, that sounds fine for some reason, despite the fact that that's a major surgery in a pregnant person for the fetus. But I guess that the reason is that it's for the fetus. So I was really wondering, like, how much I completely agree with you that we need more research in and around pregnancy. It's about everything, more or less, that it has to do with pregnancy. But sometimes I have the impression that the first step would really be to try and convince people that that should be feasible, that would be beneficial, and that you can do that in a way that is safe for the pregnant persons themselves to participate. I don't know if you had similar experience or what you think about that.
I think another problem is the legal environment. So, what if someone, especially in terms of what medication people might use, you might already have quite a bit of data. In fact, I know we have quite a bit of data available on things like taking pain medication during pregnancy. But I mean, the research ethics of actually using that data in case it can be linked up to actual people, actual miscarriages, potential, legal consequences for the people, it's just impossible. But a lot of this research around trauma and so on it doesn't need to be invasive. you know, a lot of it is just as with birth trauma. There's been a lot of qualitative research now on birth trauma, which is kind of disclosing that major source of the birth trauma is not actually the complication in itself, but the way that the birthing person is being treated during the birth and the attitudes of the clinicians around them. And I mean, for that, you don't need it's not physically invasive. Obviously, talking about traumatic experiences does also raise ethical questions, but we do that anyway. So, if you can do research on combat trauma, after people have suffered PTSD in combat, then why can't you do research on pregnancy trauma after it's happened in pregnancy? It's a lot of it is non-invasive. And yeah, and just greater awareness that this is happening. Again, that doesn't hurt people. It's a lot of it seems to be, when it comes to pregnancy trauma, at least, I think a lot of it is not actually horribly difficult. Like what I mentioned during my second pregnancy, having more ultrasound scans, more regular ultrasound scans really helped with bonding with the baby and with mental health. So, you could just do a study on, does this help people bond with their babies when they're experiencing trauma otherwise, And I mean, yeah. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that sometimes there is a big disconnect between the ethics committee and the actual people. What I see when I do research, a lot of time the ethics committee says, oh, you shouldn't do this type of research. And I do qualitative research, so I don't do anything that is invasive. But the answer is always, oh, this is too traumatic, it's too sensitive, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't, the parents will not want to talk about this, it's too much. And then my experience is that a lot of parents actually need to talk about it, and they see that even participating kind of can be very helpful for them for many reasons. So sometimes I really feel there is a big disconnect, and that we are still in the phase of protecting too much.
I wonder if it's also kind of misogyny as well. Like, we're too fragile to talk about these things.
Yeah, personally,
if they're saying either we don't need to be listened to, there's no need listening to us, or if or if you want to have a different excuse, then we're too fragile to possibly talk about.
You might regret it at some point.
Yeah, it's just, yeah.
It's frustrating.
It is. I mean, even as a one-person research ethics, just the ethics of does agreeing to give this presentation, could that make me feel worse somehow? I mean, you weigh these things up, but at the end of the day, if we're competent people to make these decisions, then
Thank you.
Please, Daphne. Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation, first of all. My question regards more philosophically the concepts and categories we associate pregnancy with. And I completely agree. I think pregnancy lacks its categories. That's why we have all these like weird analogies that are not even analogies for pregnancy, or I even find the question of, is pregnancy an illness or not an illness a bit weird, because obviously it's not an illness, but then as we've spoken about, this results in people reinforcing you about the non-illnessness of it and how it's natural and it's just a process you cope with. But at the same time, I don't like hyper-pathologizing it, even if it for most of the time does come with its own pathologies. So I wanted to ask if you think there are any concepts you find original and specific to pregnancy that help conceptualize it also for the pregnant person, and also for you, what sort of thinking and ideas and relationships conceptually helped you cope with it and understand it better. Because I think the existing frameworks are just a bit weird and very, very reductive, and not even related to pregnancy. It's just we take something and then we're like, okay, how can we tie this to pregnancy? But oftentimes that's not even, it's just a big category mistake, I feel.
I mean, in terms of the odd analogies and so on, I think metaphysics is really, there's a lot of new work in metaphysics by people like Kingma, write about the metaphysics of pregnancy. I also have to confess that actually I'm still unable to read papers or attend talks on birth and pregnancy because it's too traumatic and it's too triggering. Because, giving this talk, I can kind of manage what I'm talking about and so on, but I just find that things come up and I just find it's going to be a while before I can even read philosophy on these topics because just the PTSD is that bad. And I agree, I mean, with a lot of things, we do this really odd thing about where we feel like we have to choose between pathologizing or not pathologizing. So, that's especially when it comes to women. So the menopause is another example, which is, again, it's natural, but it can come with lots of problems. And now we seem to find a better balance when it comes to menopause by saying, well, actually, we can improve people's quality of life quite a lot by offering them hormone replacement therapy. But, this is not an illness, just like, medicine can do lots of things to help people without saying it's an illness. So sexual intercourse is another example, and contraception. So, no one would think sexual intercourse is an illness. But again, there's a lot of pathologization about not enough or too much. So that is still ongoing, especially in the case of women. But, at the same time, medicine can help with contraception without kind of pathologizing, the sexual act. And again, I think menopause is a good example where we're very slowly starting to find a better balance. But I mean, a lot of women don't find pregnancy traumatic or birth traumatic, and there should be even more. It's not, I don't think I'm really answering your question, but it's, I don't think, obviously, pregnancy in itself is not pathological, but all kinds of pathological things can happen around it. Anything to do with our bodies are not having a body is not a pathology, but all kinds of pathological things can then happen to our bodies, and it's just the same.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Daphne and Zsuzsanna. It's really a problem because how do you create a conversation? How do you create these categories without them to be strict or pathologizing? Because the goal, I don't know if it's the same for you, is for certain topics to arrive to the common audience, so to not just be in academia, so that a woman who is pregnant might feel something and go on I don't know, online somewhere, and might find other people experience this. Okay, good to know, I don't feel alone. And those who feel good, okay, they don't even do the search. That would be already something.
I think like the media and journalism and also celebrities in our particular culture, and by celebrities, I don't just mean, celebrities, but Jacinda Ardern, was Prime Minister of New Zealand at the same time as being pregnant. And she was always like, oh no, pregnancy is not an illness. Pregnant women, but the problem was she was always, all pregnant women can do anything. And at the time I was lying in bed, unable to get up, and I'm like, great, all pregnant women can do anything. This is just, it's just that people double down on these attitudes. Then the the Princess of Wales in the UK had hyperemesis as well. And she, in all the media interviews she gave, she completely minimized it. She kind of had an opportunity to talk about this is a very serious illness, and she did the opposite. And she was hospitalized multiple times. She suffered very severely from it. She was unable to do her work as a royal, whatever work they do, going along and waving at people. She was she didn't have any public appearances. She completely disappeared. She had severe hyperemesis. And then she comes out and completely minimizes it. And that's obviously reported in all the newspapers. And people reading about it, then what are they going to think? They think, well, this person says this, but I mean, I don't know why she did that, but it's not very responsible behavior. And so when I'm talking about celebrities, I think of people like Jacinda Ardern as well, who was all like, oh, pregnant women are completely capable of everything. And no, because pregnancy is not an illness, but pregnancy-related illnesses are an illness. And the problem is that even because we have this societal denial, even women who experience or people who experience these problems will then just kind of try and make it seem like it's not so serious. And I think what helped with menopause, for example, is that just having a lot of first-person reports in the media a lot of the time. So there are a lot, now there's lots and lots and lots, and that, it took a lot of activism to do that. But again, middle-aged women who are kind of at the height of their career and so on, it's much easier now to come out and talk about these things. But when you're pregnant, you're incredibly vulnerable. And even just thinking about pregnancy, it's very vulnerable. So you're really coming from a position of great vulnerability. And then I've had my experience of the menarche, which is the start of your periods, was very similar to the menopause in many ways. Like a lot of the symptoms were the same. And I bet I'm not the only one. But again, how many teenage girls are going to come out and say, oh, actually, I have all these problems suddenly with incontinence and all kinds of weird things in my body. No, they're not going to come out because they're too embarrassed. So I think it's how do we support very vulnerable people? And I just don't have the answer for that because our society is not very welcoming for this.
I totally agree. I saw that Jennifer and Nicole chimed in. I don't know if you want to say, if you want to comment aloud or just leave it that on the chat.
Sorry, I don't have the capacity to answer questions and also look
No,
at the chat.
they were commenting and they agreed with you basically.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and also, like I mentioned in my talk as well, pregnancy is seen as kind of work, and it can seem like you're not doing your work right. Like you're not pregnanting right.
Exactly. Which means that in the future you want parenting right.
Exactly.
That's this link between, how you're supposed to be properly pregnant and how you're supposed to be a proper parent, because, there's overlapping between pregnancy and motherhood. So from the moment you're pregnant, you're really a mommy.
Yeah.
So if you're unwell, that's okay. I mean, we are still talking about maternal sacrifice, which is disgusting, if you ask me. Sorry.
Yeah. But also it's just it's just, reducing that is the other problem that, it's not even to return to like an earlier point, that it's not just about when it comes to pathologization, it's not just pathologizing a bodily function or like a bodily process, but if the bodily process itself becomes a form of work, then by not doing that work properly in whatever way, is a very odd form of pathologization. I mean, you don't pathologize if you have, problems with all kinds of other body parts. You don't kind of pathologize. It seems like some kind of different process of pathologization going on. Because it's not your actions, it's what your body does that is work, possibly. I don't know.
Did you raise your hand, Jennifer? Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. So in the chat, one of the things I put in there as you were talking was the issue of the compulsory able-bodiedness that's also like parallel to kind of like our reproductive lives. Like at some point, we're always supposed to be also, doing all these like able-bodied things, even though like our bodies are doing all these exceptionally strange, kind of, part of reproductive function, right? So and so I just put in the comments about like disability justice frameworks have been really helpful for me also when it's the question of trauma, but in the question of reproduction, because I think when it comes to the non-normative in terms of what our bodies can and can't do, what our minds can and can't do, and then how to like reframe that in ways that are validating and not always like at a deficit or at a that we don't make the world we don't create accommodating spaces for right. We're always making analogies, pregnancy like a disability, pregnancy like an illness, because we don't really see pregnancy as an exceptional situation in and of itself. That's also a valuable part of the human condition and politically plural spaces, right? So the disability justice framework has been really helpful because it does counter some of the kind of the neoliberal brainwashing. Nicole posted that as well. That's where we were going back and forth in the chat. And I think that's the other thing that I'm finding really helpful about the disability language, disability studies, critical disability studies, is it's this idea that that our bodies can reclaim pleasure in ways that even when we are experiencing trauma or bodily betrayal, or that there are all these ways in which to complement a body that is in a state of that's being harmed or is sustaining harm, or that labor that you're doing to keep yourself going, even though you're up against what feels like this headwind of kind of sickness or failure or discomfort and pain. That pleasure activism has been really great. Adrienne Marie Brown and stuff like that. There's these wonderful like counter, almost like kind of doulas have a whole bunch of like ways in which there are practices that are meant to sustain one as one goes through these practices, that a lot of that knowledge, that communal sharing of things that could counter the kind of things that are traumatizing, that are there, but they're, again, lost knowledge, they're disinvested. We don't see that as, part of the marketplace. We don't see that as part of healthcare. So it becomes a resource that is, we have to like smuggle pleasure and those kind of people who know maybe practices that are sustaining and that carry one through, and one doesn't have to carry all the burden of all the trauma knowledge and all the trauma experience, and like you said, like somehow have to validate themselves through it. So that, just my last comment, I want to say this again, what you're doing, even just by putting this together, that labor that you did, thank you. Like if you write never again about this is still such a beautiful, validating, really important bit of labor that you've done for us generated.
Thank you. Well, I want to say two things to what you were saying. So firstly, at the same time as you say that, there is this overwhelm. I'll see if I can get stupid doctor sleep. It's annoying me. It's like he always knows if I'm giving a talk, and he just goes absolutely bonkers. It's he's fine every other time, right? So yeah. So at the same time, we have this kind of hyper fetishization of pregnancy as well. So you say we don't recognize this as this beautiful part of life, but you do. It's the most beautiful part of life. It's the best time of your life ever. Unless you recognize this, you are somehow failing. Pregnancy as being pregnant is you're a superwoman. And that hurts obviously people who can't get pregnant. So when I was struggling to conceive, then all this talk about, oh, this is the most beautiful thing in the world ever. And pregnant people and parents and moms, not parents, actually pregnant women. I think, we can drop the people now. Pregnant women and mothers are superheroes, and it's a superpower. That is actually, I found that actively hurtful, both when I was struggling to conceive and also when I was struggling with pregnancy complications, because obviously my superpowers were not up to task. So it just makes you feel inadequate. So this fetishization of pregnancy will then feel people inadequate. And the other thing is, you mentioned in the comments anti-Black racism in pregnancy, and in the UK, we know that non-white people have much higher chance of mortality and morbidity in pregnancy and birth. Oh, and this is the other thing I should have mentioned, but I didn't, that it's amazing how all our statistics are about mortality in pregnancy and birth, and as long as women don't die, it's good. But morbidity, I mean, I had permanent significant hearing loss during my pregnancy, and that, doesn't count as a lack of success in any statistics, because look, I'm alive, and you should just be, as long as you're alive, it's fine. And I had a very supportive obstetrician during my second pregnancy, who also, that's what, he was complaining about as well. So it's not even just women complaining about this. And now I think we're starting to see more studies on how disabled people are also harmed during pregnancy and suffer a lot more discrimination and just mortality and morbidity during pregnancy and childbirth. I think I've seen a recent study of how deaf women are more likely to experience pregnancy-related complications and birth complications. And as I've said in other talks elsewhere, there are times when, for disabled people, some of us, you do have this euthanasia, soft euthanasia thing going on as well, where some people are not meant to reproduce. So that's another problem as well. That it's that I've experienced as well. That some people are not meant to be parents, and especially some people, especially women. If you're a parent and have certain disabilities, you will encounter. I've encountered a lot of discrimination since having children because of my mental. I mean, I didn't expect to encounter a severe discrimination about being a mother and also living with mental illness. It's very bad. And I think there are various disabilities, especially ones where there's meant to be a genetic link, where women are really made to feel bad about reproductive choices of having children. And it's kind of the two sides of natalism, isn't it? That the right kind of people should be having children. White, able-bodied people should be having children. Everyone else should just, I don't know, die out.
Zsuzsanna, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a clever, honest, open-hearted talk. It's, yeah, you said several times things that crossed my mind, but I didn't know how to put words to it.
Thank you for having
yeah,
me.
that was fantastic. Thank you all for being here and having made our conversation even richer than it was from the beginning. Next Friday, we're going to host a presentation from Nathalie Deprat. The Intimate Other would be the title. So we'll be happy to have you, to see you there as well. Zsuzsanna, I have no words. Thanks again for having put your life there and add on it all your brain power. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.